The island of Manhattan, the place they now call Manhattan, has always held secrets. But in the early years of the 21st century, as the city endlessly reinvents itself, the deepest secrets are beginning to surface. In 2091, during the excavation for a new luxury condominium tower in the financial district, just blocks from Wall Street, construction crews made a discovery that would force New York to confront a ghost it had long tried to bury. 25 feet below the modern street level, in what was once the damp, marginal land at the edge of the colonial city, they found bones. This was not a formal cemetery. It was a potter's field, a place for the poor, the indigent, and the outcast. But as archaeologists from the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission took over the site, a more specific and chilling story emerged. This was the Negroes' burial ground, a 6-acre plot where from the 1690s until the late 1790s, an estimated 15,000 free and enslaved Africans were laid to rest. The city had grown over it layer by layer, erasing it from memory and maps, building its temples of commerce and government directly atop the graves of the people whose forced labor had helped lay their foundations. Among the 419 sets of remains carefully exhumed for study, one skeleton was designated Burial 335. It was the body of a woman, estimated to have died between the ages of 25 and 35. Her bones told a story of a life of relentless, brutal labor. Her spine was arthritic, her muscles powerfully built but worn down. But it was the artifact found with her that made her singular. A single, exquisitely crafted tinned copper alloy bracelet, adorned with a heart motif, was found on her wrist. In a place of anonymous death, this object was a stunning declaration of identity, of love, of a personal aesthetic that defied the system that sought to erase her. She was not just a slave, she was a woman who had worn a piece of beauty into her grave. She was given a name by the researchers, a placeholder for the one that was stolen from her by history: the African Burial Ground Woman. Her story, pieced together from bone and artifact, is the story of New York itself, a story of unimaginable wealth built on a foundation of forgotten suffering. A single beautiful bracelet has been found in a forgotten grave, a silent scream from the past demanding to be heard. It belonged to a woman whose life and name were stolen by the system of Northern slavery, a system that New York has worked for centuries to forget. But who was she? How did she live, love, and die in the bustling, brutal slave society of colonial Manhattan? The search for her identity is about to begin, and it will reveal a city far different than the one we think we know. To follow the forensic and historical investigation into the life of Burial 335, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this shocking excavation.
To understand the woman in the grave, one must first understand the city that enslaved her. In the early 18th century, as the woman of Burial 335 was born into bondage, New York was the second largest slaveholding city in the American colonies, after Charleston, South Carolina. The institution was not a Southern anomaly, it was a Northern economic engine. The very wall that gave Wall Street its name was originally built in the 1650s by enslaved Africans, a barrier against native attacks, but also a symbol of the colony's fortified exclusionary power. The center of this trade was the meal market on Wall Street, where human beings were bought, sold, and hired out alongside livestock and produce. Auction blocks stood in the shadow of Trinity Church. Advertisements in newspapers like the New York Gazette announced the arrival of a cargo of prime, healthy Negroes from the Caribbean and Africa, or offered rewards for the capture of runaways. their scars and brands meticulously described as identifying marks. The economy of the city was inextricably linked to the slave trade. The flour exported to the West Indies was ground by enslaved millers. The ships that carried it were built by enslaved caulkers and sailmakers. The wealthy families who lived in fine brick townhouses on Pearl Street and Broad Street, the Beekmans, the Van Cortlands, the Livingstons, owned the people who cooked their food, cleaned their homes, and cared for their children. The woman we called Burial 335 would have known this world intimately. She may have been born in New York, the child of an enslaved mother, her status predetermined by the doctrine of partis secutor ventrum, that which is born follows the womb. Or she may have survived the horrors of the Middle Passage, arriving at the bustling East River docks, terrified and disoriented, to be sold to a merchant, a ship captain, or a wealthy widow. Her value was recorded in a ledger, her personhood legally erased. She was property. The bracelet on her wrist, a seemingly small act of defiance, was in fact a monumental one. It was a claim to a self that the law said did not exist. The bustling, commercial heart of colonial New York was also the bustling, brutal heart of its slave market. The woman in the grave lived her entire life as someone else's legal property, her labor and her body owned by the city's elite. But how did the system function on a daily basis? What were the laws that governed her existence, and what forms of resistance were available to her and the thousands of other enslaved people in the city? The reality of urban slavery was a unique kind of psychological torture, a constant, close-quarters reminder of the freedom that was always just out of reach. To understand the tightrope she walked every day of her life, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The daily life of an enslaved person in New York was one of relentless, varied toil, all performed under the constant threat of violence and the psychological torment of proximity to freedom. The woman of Burial 335 likely did not work in a vast cotton field. Her world was the confined, crowded space of a city lot. She may have been a domestic servant, rising before dawn to light the fires, draw the water, cook the meals, and clean the house of a wealthy merchant family. Her powerful physique, evidenced by her bones, could also point to work as a laundress, a labor that involved carrying heavy buckets of water and wrestling with wet linens, or as a dock worker, hauling goods. The control exerted by masters was absolute. Slave codes, first enacted by the Dutch and expanded by the English, were brutally enforced. Enslaved people could not gather in groups larger than 3. They could not be out after dark without a lantern and a pass from their master. They could not testify in court against a white person. Punishments for infractions were public and savage: whippings, brandings, and for the persistent runaway, execution. In 1712, following a suspected slave plot, 21 enslaved Africans were executed in New York City. One man was burned alive in a slow, ceremonial fire. Yet within this cage of oppression, a rich, resilient African culture persisted and evolved. Enslaved people gathered secretly in taverns and back alleys and on the margins of the city to speak their native languages, practice burial rites, and share stories. It was in this hidden world that the woman of Burial 335 likely acquired her bracelet. Perhaps it was a gift from a lover, crafted by an enslaved blacksmith in a moment of stolen time. Perhaps it was an heirloom, passed down from a mother, a tangible link to a homeland and an identity that slavery could not completely destroy. The bracelet was not just jewelry, it was an act of cultural preservation, a secret language of the heart spoken in metal, worn brazenly on the wrist as a quiet daily rebellion. The woman's bracelet is a key that unlocks a hidden world of resistance and community. Despite the brutal constraints of slavery, the enslaved people of New York forged bonds, maintained traditions, and found ways to express their humanity. But this fragile community was perpetually under threat, not just from individual masters, but from the collective paranoia of the white population. This paranoia would eventually explode into one of the most horrific chapters in the city's history, an event that would have shaped the world of Burial 335 and sealed the fate of many of her people. What was the slave conspiracy of 1741, and how did it turn New York into a city gripped by a homicidal frenzy? The terror is coming. To witness the explosion of violence that revealed the city's deepest fears, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter. In the spring and summer of 1741, New York was a tinderbox of white anxiety. A series of 13 mysterious fires broke out, starting at Fort George, the governor's residence, and spreading to private homes and warehouses. The white population, vastly outnumbered by a combined population of enslaved and free black people, immediately suspected a conspiracy. They saw the hand of a vast, secret network of black insurgents in every flicker of flame, a plot to burn the city to the ground and murder them all in their beds. The authorities launched a ruthless inquisition. Under torture and the promise of freedom, enslaved people were forced to confess to a plot that likely never existed in the organized form the white authorities imagined. They named names, and a hysterical witch hunt began. The woman of Burial 335, a young woman in her teens or early 20s at the time, would have lived through these months in absolute terror. The normal, oppressive rules of the slave code were replaced by a city-wide pogrom. Black people, regardless of their involvement, could be arrested, tortured, and executed on the flimsiest of testimony. The retribution was swift and barbaric. Over the course of the year, more than 150 black New Yorkers were arrested and jailed. 30 were executed in a carnival of public death designed to terrorize the entire enslaved population. 17 black men were hanged and 13 were burned at the stake. Their bodies were left to rot in gibbets along the city's boundaries, a gruesome warning. The message was clear. Any assertion of autonomy, any hint of resistance would be met with exterminating violence. The heart-shaped bracelet on the wrists of Burial 335, worn in the years after this atrocity, takes on an even more profound meaning. It was not just an act of personal expression, it was an act of breathtaking courage, a refusal to be completely broken by a system that had just demonstrated its capacity for genocidal fury. The slave conspiracy of 1741 revealed the true murderous core of slavery in New York. It was a system upheld not just by laws, but by the constant threat of mass ritualized killing. The woman with the bracelet lived through this reign of terror and carried its memory with her for the rest of her life. But life and the struggle for dignity went on. How did the enslaved community endure in the decades that followed? And what was the long, slow path to the eventual abolition of slavery in New York? The wheels of history were turning, but they were grindingly slow, and freedom would not come in time for the woman in the grave. To follow the political and personal struggles that led to the Gradual Manumission Act, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
In the decades following the hysteria of 1741, the movement for abolition began to gain a fragile foothold in New York, fueled by the egalitarian rhetoric of the American Revolution. The woman of Burial 335 would have been in her 40s or 50s during the war, and she would have heard the promises of liberty that filled the air. The British, in fact, offered freedom to any enslaved person who fled a rebel master and reached their lines, a promise that led thousands to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Yet when the war ended and New York became part of the new United States, the reality for its black population changed with agonizing slowness. In 1785, the New York Manumission Society was founded by powerful figures like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton.
but their approach was paternalistic and cautious. The real turning point was the gradual Manumission Act of 1799. This law, a masterpiece of legislative compromise, did not free a single enslaved person immediately. Instead, it declared that children born to enslaved mothers after the 4th of July of that year would be free, but only after serving a lengthy indenture to their mother's master until they reached the age of 25 for women and 28 for men. For those already enslaved, like our Burial 335 woman, the act offered nothing. They would remain in bondage for life. This created a bizarre and painful limbo. The woman would have seen children born into a technical future freedom, while she herself and every other adult slave knew they would die in chains. The final abolition of slavery in New York would not come until the 28th of July, 1827. By the time that day of Jubilee arrived, the woman with the heart bracelet had been in the cold ground of the Negro's burial ground for decades. She had lived her entire life within sight of freedom, a freedom that was legislated, debated, and promised, but one that was systematically, cruelly denied to her. Her bracelet is a testament to a life lived in the shadow of a promise that never came true. The promise of freedom in New York was a slow, grinding process that excluded an entire generation of enslaved people, including the woman's bones, whose bones were found under Broadway. She died as she had lived, as property. Her burial in the segregated Potter's Field was the final indignity, an anonymous internment in a forgotten plot. But the story of the African burial ground does not end with her death. How was this sacred ground, holding the remains of 15,000 souls, so completely erased from the city's memory? And what was the epic struggle in the 1990s that finally forced New York to acknowledge the bones it had built upon? The fight to reclaim this history is a dramatic story in its own right. To learn how the lost were found, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
For 200 years, the city of New York forgot. It paved over the Negro's burial ground, layer by layer. It built warehouses, parking garages, and finally a massive federal office building directly on top of it. The 15,000 souls were silenced, their existence relegated to a few obscure lines in old guidebooks. That silence was shattered in 1991, when the General Services Administration, or GSA, began excavation for a new federal building at 290 Broadway. The first bones were treated as a nuisance, an archaeological obstacle to progress. But a small group of activists, historians, and members of the city's African-American community, led by Dr. Michael Blakey, an African-American biological anthropologist, recognized the site for what it was, one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history. They launched a fierce political and public campaign to stop the construction and demand respectful treatment of the remains. They stood in front of bulldozers. They held vigils. They argued that this was not just an archaeological site, but an American sacred ground. The struggle was intense. The federal government initially resisted, but the moral force of the argument was undeniable. The project was halted, the site was redesigned, and the remains of the 419 individuals were carefully exhumed and sent to Howard University for a decade of study, led by Dr. Blakey. The research revealed, in stunning scientific detail, the brutal reality of their lives, the physical stress, the malnutrition, the violence. The woman with the bracelet, Burial 335, became a powerful symbol of the project. Her story, pieced together from her bones and her single, beautiful artifact, gave a name and a face to the thousands who had been forgotten. In 2003, the remains were returned to New York in a procession of horse-drawn carriages and a ceremony filled with African drumming and libations. They were reinterred in the African Burial Ground National Monument, a permanent memorial at the site, a place of contemplation and remembrance in the shadow of skyscrapers. The woman's bracelet is now housed in the on-site museum, a silent, powerful witness to the resilience of the human spirit. Her story and the story of the burial ground forces a reckoning. It reminds us that the prosperity of modern New York and of the entire nation was built not just on ideas of freedom, but on the forced labor of people whose names we will never know, but whose bones still bear witness. The discovery and preservation of the African burial ground is one of the most important acts of historical reclamation in American history. It returned a stolen past to the nation's conscience and gave a measure of dignity back to the forgotten. The woman with the heart bracelet, who lived and died in bondage, is now a teacher. Her life and her single artifact speaking volumes about loss, love, and resistance. Her story is the true foundation of New York, a story of unimaginable pain and unbreakable spirit. If you are drawn to the deepest and most dramatic stories of history, to the moments where the past refuses to stay buried, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the darkest corners of history and the human experience.
The scientific analysis of Burial 335 allowed researchers to build a startlingly detailed portrait of the anonymous woman. Isotope analysis of her teeth suggested she was likely born not in Africa, but in New York or the surrounding region, a second or third generation enslaved person. This made her bracelet an object of African-inspired design, not a memory of a homeland she never knew, but a conscious act of cultural preservation, a choice to identify with a heritage that was systematically being stripped away. Her skeletal remains revealed a life of immense physical duress. The powerful muscle attachments on her arms and shoulders confirmed a life of hard labor, likely involving the repetitive lifting and carrying of heavy loads. Degenerative joint disease in her spine and the wear on her vertebrae were consistent with the back-breaking work of a domestic servant or laundress. But there was more. Microscopic analysis revealed evidence of cribra orbitala, porotic lesions on her skull that are a telltale sign of chronic anemia, often caused by malnutrition or parasitic diseases, a common affliction for the enslaved who were given the poorest quality food. Yet, amidst this evidence of a life of hardship, the bracelet stood as a defiant counter-narrative. The craftsmanship was sophisticated. It was made of a tinned copper alloy designed to mimic more expensive silver, and the heart motif was carefully executed. This was not a crude homemade trinket. It may have been commissioned from a skilled blacksmith, perhaps an enslaved artisan, using stolen materials and time. It may have been a treasured item passed through a family, a secret heirloom of immense sentimental value. The very act of wearing it, of adorning her body that was owned by another, was a profound assertion of selfhood. She was making a statement. I am not just what you see. I have a heart. I have love. I have beauty. I am me. The forensic evidence has given us a woman of flesh and blood, a New Yorker who endured a life of brutal labor and poor health, but who fiercely held on to her identity. The bracelet is the key to her inner world. But who did she love? Who loved her? Was the bracelet a gift from a husband, a token from a child, a reminder of a mother?
The silence of the grave holds these secrets tight. Yet, by examining the lives of other enslaved people in New York, we can imagine the community that sustained her and the relationships that gave her the strength to endure. What did family and love look like in the shadow of slavery? The search for her heart continues. To explore the stolen families and resilient loves of enslaved New York, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
For an enslaved person in New York, the family was a precarious institution, perpetually under threat of being shattered by the economic whims of a master. Marriage between enslaved people was not legally recognized. Families could be, and were, broken up at any moment. A husband could be sold to a different city. Children could be taken from their mothers and hired out or given away as gifts. The woman of Burial 335 almost certainly knew this terror intimately. Her heart-shaped bracelet may have been the only permanent token of a relationship that was violently severed. Church records from the colonial era provide fleeting, heartbreaking glimpses of these stolen families. The records of Trinity Church and the Dutch Reformed Church sometimes note the baptism of enslaved children, often listing only the mother's name, the father being deemed irrelevant or unknown. They record the marriages of enslaved couples, performed without legal standing but rich with personal and spiritual meaning for the community. These acts, baptism, marriage, were assertions of humanity in a world that denied it. Within the segregated space of the Negro's burial ground, we see evidence of this deep care for family and community. Some bodies were buried in shrouds fastened with straight pins, a sign of a community that took the time to prepare its dead with dignity, even in poverty. Others were buried with personal items, beads, pipes, and in the case of our woman, a beautiful bracelet. These were not merely objects, they were messages to the afterlife, declarations of identity and belonging that were meant to last for eternity. The woman's bracelet, therefore, was not just a personal adornment. It was a testament to her connections. It symbolized the love she gave and received within a community that nurtured its own, even as the outside world sought to destroy it. She was buried with her most precious possession because it represented the one thing slavery could not completely own: her heart. The woman's bracelet is a symbol of love that persisted in the face of a system designed to make love impossible. It represents the families created, the communities sustained, and the humanity defended by enslaved New Yorkers. But her story is also one of death and burial. Why was she interred in this particular plot? What can her burial itself tell us about the beliefs, the fears, and the hopes of the people who laid her to rest? The rituals of death are a window into the soul of a culture. To understand the final journey of the woman with the bracelet and the sacred significance of the ground in which she was laid, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The Negro's burial ground was more than a dumping ground. It was a sacred space where the African diaspora in New York could honor their dead according to their own spiritual beliefs, often in secret defiance of Christian norms imposed by their masters. The burial practices observed by archaeologists tell a story of cultural endurance. The bodies were, for the most part, buried in wooden coffins, a sign of community care. But more significantly, many were buried with their heads to the west, a practice not common in Christian tradition, but deeply rooted in African spiritual beliefs, specifically from the Akan culture of Ghana, suggesting that the soul would return to Africa in the afterlife. The artifacts found with the dead are particularly revealing. Beads, shells, and crystals were placed with the bodies, likely serving as charms or conduits for spiritual power. The woman's bracelet fits perfectly within this tradition. A heart, a universal symbol of life and essence, crafted from metal, could have held profound spiritual significance. It may have been an object of protection, a charm to safeguard her soul on her journey, or to ensure her identity was recognized by her ancestors in the next world. Her burial was an act of communal resistance. The people who washed her body, who placed her in a coffin, who fastened her bracelet securely on her wrist, and who lowered her into the earth while speaking prayers in a mix of English and African tongues, were performing a radical act. They were claiming her, and by extension themselves, as spiritual beings with a destiny that transcended their earthly bondage. They were building their own kingdom of the dead, a city beneath the city, where the rules of the white man no longer applied. In death, she was finally, fully free. The Negro's burial ground was a landscape of spiritual resistance, where the enslaved community defied the system that oppressed them by honoring their dead with dignity and according to their own traditions. The woman with the bracelet was laid to rest with love and spiritual care. But what became of this sacred ground? How could a cemetery holding 15,000 souls simply vanish from the city's consciousness? The story of its erasure is a story of willful forgetting, a deliberate act by a city eager to bury the most uncomfortable chapter of its past. The process of this historical amnesia is as revealing as the discovery itself. To understand how New York forgot its founding sin, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the final chapter.
The erasure of the Negro's burial ground began almost as soon as it was closed in the late 1790s. As New York expanded northward and land values skyrocketed, the marginal land of the burial ground became prime real estate. The city, in an act of profound disrespect, simply covered it over and sold the lots for development. It was a practical, brutal decision, motivated by greed and a desire to forget the problem of slavery that had once been so central to its identity. By the time slavery was finally abolished in New York in 1827, the city was already crafting a new narrative for itself, a bastion of free labor and progressive commerce. The uncomfortable truth that its wealth was built on a foundation of enslaved labor was conveniently swept under the literal pavement. The burial ground and the thousands of people in it became an inconvenience, a secret to be kept. For over 200 years, the secret held. The rediscovery of the burial ground in 1991 was therefore not just an archaeological event, it was a psychological earthquake for the city and the nation. It forced a public reckoning with a past that had been deliberately obscured. It proved that the North's hands were not clean, that the cancer of slavery had infected the entire American body politic. The woman with the bracelet, Burial 335, became the face of this reckoning. Her story, told through her bones and her single beautiful artifact, is a permanent correction to the historical record. Today, the African Burial Ground National Monument stands as a place of pilgrimage and education. The woman's bracelet is displayed there, not as a relic of oppression, but as a trophy of the human spirit. It is a reminder that history is not what is written in books by the powerful. It is also what is buried in the earth by the powerless, waiting for the day when the world is ready to listen. The price of modernity, the monument whispers, was paid in the blood, sweat, and tears of people like her. And we, who walk on the island they built,
have a sacred responsibility to remember their names, even if we know only the shape of the hearts they left behind. The story of the African burial ground and the woman with the heart bracelet is a complete journey from life to death to rediscovery. It is a tale that exposes the brutal reality of Northern slavery and celebrates the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It challenges the myth of a free North and forces us to confront the uncomfortable foundations of American prosperity. This story is not a footnote. It is a central chapter in the American saga. If you are drawn to the deepest and most dramatic stories of history, to the moments where the past refuses to stay buried, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the darkest corners of history and the human experience.